The commander's periscope fogs at the edges, and Hauptmann Ernst Georg's first thought that morning is a small one. The glass is cold. The fog off the Marne-Rhine Canal is thick, and he wants coffee. It is dawn on the 19th of September, 1944, east of a French town called Arracourt, that no one in the 5th Panzer Army had bothered to memorize. His Panther idles in a column of steel, engine warm, crew quiet, 70 tons of the finest tank Germany still knows how to build purring beneath him. Ahead, the lead Panther crests a low rise in the mist. He watches its long 75mm gun swing left, hunting. Then, the tank simply comes apart. A flat crack rolls back over the column. The turret jumps on its ring, and a column of oily black climbs where the machine had been. There is no muzzle flash, no gun, nothing at all to mark the thing that killed it, and when his own gunner traverses toward the tree line, where the shot must have come from, there is nothing there either. No tank, no smoke, no track marks worth the name, just empty French farmland, going gray to green as the fog lifts. That is the problem this whole video is about. A German panzer force that outweighed and outgunned everything the Americans had at Arracourt, kept dying to shots it could not source, from an American tank destroyer outfit that seemed to shoot and then cease to exist, and the men on the receiving end, professional soldiers who had killed T-34s by the hundred in Russia, started calling that unit the Ghosts. Before we get into how a lightly armored American battalion did that to Panthers in broad daylight, do the small thing that keeps work like this alive. Like the video, subscribe so the next one finds you, and if your family had a man in the 4th Armored or the tank destroyer battalions that fought around Nancy that autumn, put his name in the comments. These crews are barely remembered. They should be. Here is what the German after-action people could not make fit. The tank that killed the lead Panther was almost certainly an M18, and by every specification sheet in the Wehrmacht's files, the M18 had no business winning. It carried the same 76mm gun the Americans bolted onto their Shermans, a gun that struggled against the Panther's glacis plate at any honest range. Its armor topped out around half an inch. A rifle-caliber machine gun could hurt the crew if they stood in the open-topped turret. On paper, a Panther should have detected it, ranged it, and destroyed it before the American ever finished aiming. The Panther's gun could kill the M18 through the front, through the side, through the rear, through more or less anything, out past 2,000 yards. So the German assessment, reasonable and confident and completely wrong, was that this would be a slaughter running the correct direction. They had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic said the Ghosts should be dead. The arithmetic left out one number, and it is the only number that mattered that morning. The M18 Hellcat could move at nearly 60 miles an hour, which made it the fastest tracked fighting vehicle any nation fielded in the entire war, faster than some of the staff cars behind the German lines. Think about what that speed buys a crew that knows the ground. You fire from a hedgerow, you kill a tank, and before the enemy gunners have even agreed on where the shot came from, your driver has reversed off the firing line and sprinted 300 yards to a second position you scouted at first light. By the time a Panther turret, slow, deliberate, hydraulically honest, swings to the smoke is all that is left. The American shoots again, from somewhere else, from a direction that makes no tactical sense to a man who is still looking at the wrong field. One tank destroyer, moving fast and picked well, could read to a frightened crew like 3 or 4 guns firing from a ring. And the fog that morning, thick off the canal, did the Americans a favor the Germans never forgave. It hid the dust and the movement, and it turned a machine into a rumor. Ernst Georg's column had rolled toward Arracourt, believing it held every advantage a tanker could want: heavier armor, a better gun, more experience, momentum. All of that was real. None of it was going to be enough, and over the next 72 hours, the 5th Panzer Army was going to learn, tank by burning tank, exactly why. To understand how the ghosts got their name, we have to go back a few weeks, to a muddy assembly area in Lorraine, and to the men learning to drive the fastest tank killer America ever built. General Leslie McNair looks at a battlefield he never saw and designs a weapon around a fear. The fear was 1940, and it was the sight of German panzer divisions punching through the French army in a matter of days, whole armored fists concentrated at one point and driving deep before anyone could react. McNair ran Army ground forces, and he drew the wrong lesson in a very logical way. He decided the answer to a mass of enemy tanks was not more American tanks. Those were for exploitation, for the breakthrough, for the open running once a hole was made. The answer was a specialist. A hunter built to rush to the threatened sector, kill the panzers, and get out. He called them tank destroyers, and he gave them a slogan that tells you everything about the doctrine: seek, strike, destroy. Read that slogan again and notice what is not in it. Nothing about holding ground, nothing about taking a hit. The whole idea was to arrive fast, ambush hard, and never be where the enemy swung back to. On paper, the concept had real elegance. In practice, the Army spent 2 years arguing with itself about how to build the thing. The first attempts were honest junk. Someone bolted a French 75mm field gun onto a half-track and called it the M3, which gave the crew a decent gun and the protection of a canvas jacket. Someone else put a gun on a 3/4-ton truck. These were expedients, and the men who took them into Tunisia in 1943 found out fast what happens when a thin-skinned improvisation meets a real panzer attack in the open. At Kasserine, tank destroyer units got mauled. The after-action reports were blunt about it. What the desert taught was not that the doctrine was wrong, but that the machine had to be purpose-built, and it had to be fast enough to make the run and vanish part real instead of theoretical. So what did the Americans actually want? They wrote it down. They wanted a full traversing turret, not a fixed casemate, because a hunter has to shoot in any direction the prey appears. They wanted a gun that could kill armor, and above everything, they wanted speed, not road march speed, but the kind of sprint that lets a crew relocate faster than an enemy gunner can react. Buick got the contract, and Buick, a company that in peacetime sold comfortable sedans to American families, delivered something vicious. The M18 Hellcat weighed under 20 tons, less than half what a Panther carried, and that was the entire point. Every pound they refused to add to the armor, they spent on going fast. They hung a radial aircraft-style engine in the back and paired it with a torque-matic transmission, an automatic, at a time when most tank crews on Earth were still stamping on clutches and grinding through gears. A Hellcat driver moved a lever and went. On a test track, the thing touched 60 miles an hour, and even across broken country, it could do things no other tracked vehicle in the war could match. The trade-off was written in that half-inch of steel. A Hellcat could not trade blows with anything. Stand still in front of a Panther, and you died. The design bet the crew's lives on never having to stand still. The gun was the 76 millimeter, and here is where you have to be honest, in a way the recruiting posters were not. Against the Panther's frontal armor, at range, that gun was marginal. It could be defeated by that big sloped glacis plate on a bad angle at a bad distance. But the doctrine already had the answer built in, because the doctrine never intended a frontal fight. Get to the flank. Get to the side armor, which on a Panther was far thinner than the front. From there, the 76 punched through cleanly, and the Hellcat's speed was exactly the tool that bought the angle. You did not out-armor a Panther. You outmaneuvered it, put a shot into the cheek or the flank or the engine deck, and were 300 yards gone before the return shot came. That is the weapon that rolled into Lorraine in September of 1944. Open-topped, thin-skinned, absurdly fast, carrying a gun that was a problem head-on, and a killer from the side. It was, in cold terms, a glass cannon with a race engine, and whether it worked at all depended entirely on the men inside it, reading the ground faster than the enemy could think. The doctrine had been argued over, bled for in Tunisia, and refined into a machine that asked its crews to trade every ounce of protection for the chance to shoot first and disappear. The 4th Armored Division's tank destroyer crews were about to prove whether that trade was worth making. A 3-inch towed anti-tank gun weighs 2.5 tons, and a crew of 9 has to manhandle it into position by muscle, spade, and swearing. That gun was the other half of McNair's tank destroyer force, and it is the piece everyone forgets when they talk about Hellcats. Half the tank destroyer battalions in the Army were not built around fast turreted vehicles at all. They were towed. A truck dragged the gun forward. The crew dug it in, camouflaged it, and waited for the Panzers to come to them. On paper, again, elegant. In the field it was a death sentence written in slow motion. Think about what that gun asks of the men serving it. It cannot move once the shooting starts. It has no armor at all. The shield in front is proof against rifle fire, and nothing heavier. To engage a Panther, the crew has to let the tank come inside a range where their 3-inch shell has a prayer against that sloped armor, which means letting a 70-ton machine drive toward them until it is close enough to see the gun. And the moment the gun fires, the muzzle blast kicks up a cloud of dust and debris that hangs in the air and points at the crew like an arrow. One shot, and every enemy tank in the field knows exactly where you are. So what happened when this met a real armored attack? The answer came in the Ardennes in December of 1944, and it was ugly. Towed battalions caught in the path of the German offensive got overrun where they stood. They could not displace fast enough when the line broke. A truck and a 2.5-ton gun do not outrun a Panzer breakthrough on a frozen road, and crews faced a choice between abandoning the gun, the whole reason they existed, or dying beside it. Many died beside it. The after-action analysis of the towed battalions is one of the bleakest documents in the tank destroyer story, and the Army's own historians did not soften it. The towed gun was obsolete against massed armor almost from the moment it was fielded, but the toe-to-toe failure ran deeper than just the towed guns, and this is the part that gets to the heart of McNair's whole idea. The doctrine imagined tank destroyers massing, Battalions of guns concentrated at the threatened point, meeting the Panzer wedge with a wall of fire, seek and strike and destroy in one great head-on collision. It almost never happened that way. The Germans rarely obliged by attacking exactly where the guns were massed and waiting. When they did attack, they came with infantry, artillery, and air working together, and a static line of anti-tank guns is a wonderful target for all three. The doctrine manuals left out what the fighting made obvious. A tank destroyer that stands and fights loses the one advantage its thin skin was supposed to buy. The Hellcat gave up armor for speed on the explicit bet that it would never need armor because it would never be caught standing. Park it in a fixed defensive line, and you have thrown away the trade. Now it is just a lightly armored vehicle with a marginal gun sitting still, waiting for a Panther to range it, and the Panther will win that exchange 9 times out of 10. Standing and fighting turned every strength into a liability. The early crews learned this in blood. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the desert before that, tank destroyer units that tried to slug it out frontally against German armor got the worst of it. The 76 could not reliably kill a Panther from the front, so a frontal duel meant firing shots that bounced while the enemy fired shots that did not. Crews watched their rounds spark off that glacis plate and skip into the sky, and then watched the return fire arrive. The math of a stand-up fight was simple, and it was against them. What the survivors took away from all of it was a single hard lesson that inverted the entire original concept. Do not mass, do not stand, and do not meet armor head-on to trade fire, because in a trade of fire, the heavier, better gun tank wins. The tank destroyer was never a wall. It was a knife, and a knife works from the side and the back, in and out, never squared up against the thing it is trying to kill. That lesson did not come from a manual. It came from crews who had tried it the other way and buried the men who tried it with them. By the time the 4th Armored's tank destroyers reached Lorraine, the ones who had been paying attention understood exactly what their machine was and was not for. The question at Arracourt was whether they could do the opposite of everything the doctrine had first promised, and make a thin-skinned gun on tracks into something the Germans could not find. The 1104th Tank Destroyer Battalion had learned its trade in the olive country west of Tunis, and the men who came out of Africa alive did not talk about doctrine. They talked about ground. A veteran commander walking a new position did not look for a field of fire the way the manual drew it, a clean open lane with a Panther obligingly centered in the sight. He looked for the reverse slope, the hedgerow with a gap he could back through, the sunken farm track that let a 20-ton machine move a quarter mile without showing its hull. The first thing the desert taught was that the man who is seen first is the man who dies. Everything else came after that. So how do you make a Hellcat disappear on open Lorraine farmland? You start before the enemy arrives. The good battalions turned reconnaissance into religion. A gun did not simply park where the map looked promising. A crew scouted its firing position, and then scouted the next 2 positions it would flee to, driving the routes in daylight so the driver could run them blind through smoke or dawn fog. They cut branches and wired them to the hull. They backed into tree lines until only the muzzle cleared the brush. They killed the dust signature by choosing damp, low ground over dry. The whole art was to fire 1 or 2 rounds and be gone before the muzzle smoke finished lifting, because the second and third shots from a fixed spot were what got you killed. A stationary gun that fired 3 times had, in effect, drawn a map to itself. The flank was the other half of the religion. Head on. The 76 was a coin flip against a Panther, and the veterans had watched too many coins come up wrong. So they set their positions to catch armor in the side. At the moment a column turned or crested, or committed to a lane it could not quickly leave. Let the lead tank pass. Take the flank of the second. When the survivors traversed toward the smoke, they were showing their own flanks to a second gun, 300 yards away, that had been waiting for exactly that panic. The Germans, honest professionals, kept doing the correct thing, orienting toward the threat, and the correct thing kept feeding them into a second ambush. There is a line from the Army's own study of the tank destroyer force that I keep coming back to, because it says the quiet part plainly. The self-propelled units that succeeded, it concluded, did so not by superior armor or superior guns, but by superior use of terrain and the willingness to fire and displace before the enemy could reply. Their words, near enough, superior use of terrain, not the 60-mile-an-hour engine or the turret, and not the gun either, the dirt. The men had turned a thin-skinned machine into a weapon by refusing to fight the fight it would lose. That willingness to run was the hardest thing to teach, and it is worth sitting with, because it cut against everything a young crew wanted to feel. The instinct after a kill is to stay and confirm it, to fire again at the next target already in the sight, to hold the ground you just won. The veterans beat that instinct out of the replacements. You shoot, you go, even if a fat target is sitting right there, because the target you can see can also see your smoke. Displacement was not cowardice, and it was not caution. It was the entire weapon system. A Hellcat that stayed to gloat was a Hellcat that a Panther gunner finally calmly ranged and killed. A Hellcat that vanished after one shot became something the enemy could not locate, could not count, could not fight, and could not answer. Multiply that discipline across a battalion, and you get the effect that broke German nerves at Arracourt. 4 or 5 guns, each firing once and relocating, each picking flanks, reads on the receiving end as a dozen guns firing from everywhere. The fog that September morning only sharpened it, but the technique did not need fog. It needed crews who had buried enough friends to trust the drill completely. Fire, reverse, run the pre-scouted route, kill again from a direction that made no sense to the men dying. None of this was in McNair's original vision. The doctrine had promised a massed wall meeting, a massed charge. What the veterans built instead was closer to poaching. Patient, hidden, one clean shot from the dark, and then nothing where the shot had been. The 4th Armored supporting tank destroyers reached the Lorraine front, carrying that hard-won playbook in their hands, not their manuals. On the 19th of September, a confident, better-armed Panzer brigade was about to drive straight into it, certain it was hunting, unaware it was the prey. 7 Panther brigades worth of confidence rolled toward Nancy that September, and the 5th Panzer Army's newest formation, the 113th Panzer Brigade, had roughly 200 fighting vehicles and a mission to smash the American flank. Fresh crews, factory new Panthers, an officer corps certain that green Americans would break on contact. On paper, it was a hammer. What no one in the brigade understood, driving through the fog on the 19th, was that the ground ahead had already been read, walked, and marked by men who had buried friends in Tunisia to learn how. The fog was the first gift. Visibility that morning ran to a couple hundred yards, sometimes less, and a Panther's great advantage, a gun that could kill at 2,000 meters, was worth nothing when you could not see 200. The Germans drove into it anyway, columns nose to tail on the roads, because the fog forced them to bunch, and bunching on a road is exactly the geometry a flank gunner prays for. Near the village of Lizy, a platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion sat hidden, engines off, muzzles pointed at a lane the German column had to use. They let the lead tanks come. Out of the mist, the Panthers loomed, big and confident, hulls turned broadside to guns they never saw. The first rounds went into flanks at ranges so short the 76 could not miss, and the sloped armor did not matter. 3 Panthers burning in under a minute, and then the Hellcats were already moving, backing down pre-scouted tracks before the German gunners could swing toward the smoke. Slow down on that, because the fog only did half the work. The other half was that the Americans had chosen where to be. Somebody had stood on that ground the day before and picked the lane, ranged the reference points, sighted the guns to catch a column in the side, and marked the routes out. When the Germans finally traversed toward the burning tanks, they were showing fresh flanks to guns that had already relocated. The gunners fired, displaced, then killed again from a new angle. The Panzer crews were fighting an enemy that seemed to be in 4 places at once, and none of them for longer than a shot. By the end of that first day, the 113th had lost dozens of tanks and taken almost nothing in return. Over the 72 hours around Arracourt, the numbers get lopsided in a way that reads like a typo. The American armored and tank destroyer force, outnumbered and outgunned on paper, destroyed something on the order of 260 German tanks and assault guns, while losing a fraction of that. Sources differ on the exact tallies. Unit claims always run hot, and the fog made confirmation a nightmare. But every serious count comes out catastrophically against the Germans. Their word, in the after-action reviews, catastrophic. The mist lifted and burned off across those days, and then it came back, and the pattern held either way. In clear weather, the American fighter bombers joined in, and a Panzer brigade that had already learned to fear the tree lines now had to fear the sky too. The Germans were caught between an enemy they could not see on the ground and an enemy they could not hide from in the air. What the fog started, the fields and the jobos finished. 3 months later, in the frozen Ardennes, the same technique showed up in reverse conditions and worked the same way. Snow instead of fog, but the same low visibility, the same bunched German columns forced onto roads, the same Hellcats waiting in tree lines to take engine decks and flanks at close range. At places like Krinkelt and along the northern shoulder, tank destroyer crews let heavy German armor grind past fixed points and then hit it from the side as it committed to a lane it could not leave. A King Tiger with frontal armor no 76 could crack was still just thin steel on the flank and the rear, and a crew that had the patience to wait for the side shot did not need to solve the front at all. What the Germans experienced from inside the hull was worse than losing. It was losing to something they could not find. A shot arrives, a tank brews up, the gunners swing toward the flash, and there is nothing there, only mist or falling snow, and then another shot from somewhere else entirely. You cannot fight what you cannot locate, cannot count, cannot answer. The 5th Panzer Army came to Lorraine to hunt. It spent 3 days being taken apart by an enemy it kept mistaking for empty ground. A German gunner traverses his turret toward the burning wreck of the tank ahead of him, thumb ready on the trigger, and finds the tree line empty. There is smoke where the shot came from, a smear of it drifting off a hedgerow 90 yards away, and nothing under the smoke. No gun, no engine noise, no crew scrambling. He stares at the spot where the flash had been, and the spot stares back, ordinary and green and stupidly quiet. And then the second round comes in from his left rear and takes the tank beside him in the flank. He never sees that one either. Do this to a man once, and he calls it bad luck. Do it to him 4 times in a morning, and something in him starts to come loose. Picture the German advance up the ground at Arracourt, because the geography of it is the whole story. A Panther takes a hit, bruise, and the surviving crews do the trained, sensible thing. They push toward the source of fire, because closing the range is how you kill a hidden gun. They grind forward over the same wet fields, past their own dead, and they reach the hedgerow. The firing position is there. You can read it in the crushed grass and the ejected shell casings still warm on the dirt. The gun that made them is gone, not retreating in sight, not visible fleeing across the next field. Gone into a sunken track someone scouted the day before, already laid up 300 yards away with the muzzle trained on the very ground the Germans are now standing on, confused, exposed, looking down at brass casings and asking each other where it went. That is the moment the fear got its name. Not the losing. German crews had lost before, in Normandy, in Russia, and they knew what a bad day looked like. This was different in kind. An enemy you cannot find is an enemy you cannot fight, and an enemy you cannot fight starts to feel less like men in a machine, and more like the field itself deciding to kill you. The 113th crews were fresh, most of them, and freshness is the worst possible condition in which to meet this. Veterans might have slowed down, probed, refused to chase. Green crews chased. They did exactly what the vanishing gun wanted, closing on smoke, turning their flanks, dying in the same lanes their friends had just died in. Sources conflict on who first used the word. The story that stuck is that surviving Panzer crews and their officers began talking about Gespenster, ghosts, about an American unit that fired from nowhere and was never where the fire had been. I have not found the single clean document that pins the word to one prisoner on one date, and I am not going to pretend I have. What is documented in the after-action reviews and the interrogations is the shape of the fear underneath the word. German crews describing an enemy they could not locate, could not count, could not pin down, and could not close with. The nickname is the folklore. The bewilderment is on the record, and here is the cruel arithmetic of it. There were never as many Hellcats as the Germans thought. A handful of guns, each firing once and running, reads on the receiving end as a battalion firing from every hedge on the horizon. The Panzer brigade that came to Lorraine believing it outnumbered and outgunned the Americans was, in a narrow local sense, correct. And it did not matter at all, because you cannot bring numbers to bear on a target that shows itself for 3 seconds and then becomes a patch of empty grass. The Germans had the tanks. The Americans had the ground, and they refused to stand still long enough to be counted. Think about what that morning actually was. A brigade of new Panthers, the best tank on the field gun for gun, crewed by men doing everything their training demanded, advancing on the enemy, orienting toward threats, pressing the attack. Every correct instinct fed them deeper into the kill. The promise had been a stand-up armored fight the Germans knew how to win. The outcome was crews standing over warm shell casings in an empty field, turning in slow circles, waiting for the shot they would not see. By the third day, the 113th Panzer Brigade had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Its tanks were scattered, burning across the fields east of Nancy, and the men who lived carried out of Lorraine a story about ghosts, because ghost was the only word that fit an enemy who killed you from ground you had already searched. The thin-skinned machine McNair's doctrine had nearly wasted had become, in the hands of men who learned to disappear, the thing a Panzer crew feared most. The shot from nowhere, and then nothing where the shot had been. The fields east of Nancy, 3 days after the fog first rolled in, looked like a scrapyard someone had set on fire and then abandoned. Burned-out Panthers sat nose down in ditches, hatches sprung open, engine decks split where a shell had gone in from the side and lit the fuel. Some of them had barely a scratch on the front glacis, the armor the Germans had trusted, the armor that could shrug off a 76 at range, clean and unmarked, while the flank behind it was punched through like tin. Walk that ground with a clipboard, and the story writes itself in the entry holes. Almost none of them are in the front. That detail is the whole campaign in one image. The best protected tank on the battlefield, killed again and again through the one plate no crew could keep pointed at the threat. The ledger from those 72 hours is the part that reads like a clerical error. Count it conservatively, and the 4th Armored's tanks and its supporting tank destroyers wrecked something on the order of 260 German armored vehicles across the Arracourt fighting. American losses ran to a small fraction of that. A couple dozen vehicles, many of them recoverable, dragged back and repaired and fighting again within days. The 113th Panzer Brigade, 200 vehicles strong when it started, was combat ineffective by the 3rd day. Its sister formation, the 111th, fared no better. 2 fresh brigades fed into Lorraine, and 2 brigades broken on the same anvil. I want to be honest about those numbers, because unit claims always run hot, and the fog made confirmation a nightmare. Some of the German vehicles were finished by the fighter bombers once the weather cleared, not by the guns. The exact split between the Jabos and the Hellcats will never be clean, and a tidy percentage would be a guess, but the direction of the ledger is not in dispute in any serious account, German or American. The 5th Panzer Army lost the bulk of its armor in the Nancy sector and inflicted almost nothing proportional in return. The captured crews are where it stops being arithmetic and starts being human. Pull the interrogation summaries, and a pattern comes up over and over in the prisoners' own descriptions. Not defiance, not the usual sullen professionalism, but confusion. They could not tell their interrogators how many American guns had engaged them. They overcounted wildly, because a handful of Hellcats firing once and running had felt like a wall of artillery. They described being fired on from directions that made no tactical sense, from ground their own tanks had already rolled across. One theme surfaces again and again. They never saw what killed them. They saw the flash, the wreck beside them, the empty hedge. That was all. Think about the young Panther gunner sitting in that interrogation tent, cold, and trying to explain to an American officer through a translator why his brigade is gone. He has the better tank. He knows he has the better tank. His gun outranges theirs by more than a mile. His armor is thicker. His optics are finer. And he has been told all of this is decisive. And it did not save a single vehicle in his platoon. What he actually reported, stripped of the shock, was worse than a complaint. It was a man describing a fight in which none of his advantages ever got to happen. That is the resolution of the thing the whole script has been circling. McNair built a machine that traded armor for speed and asked its crews to shoot first and vanish, and for 2 years the doctrine looked like a mistake paid for in burning open-topped Hellcats. Then, for 72 hours in the fog east of Nancy, the trade paid off at a rate no one had dared to promise. The thin skin never mattered, because the enemy never got the shot. And the weak gun did the job every time, fired into a flank at 300 yards. Every disadvantage the critics had catalogued was cancelled by a single fact. The Germans could not find the men who were killing them. Smell of scorched paint and diesel over the wet fields, brass casings gone green in the grass, and a graveyard of the best tanks in the world killed by the sides no one could armor. The Panzer crews carried out a word for it, because a word was all they had left. Not a unit designation, not a count, not a map reference, a ghost story. And the coldest part of the whole ledger is that the ghosts were never many. A few guns, a few crews who had buried friends in Africa to learn the drill, refusing to stand still long enough to be counted, and killing until there was nothing left to count on the other side. 30 seconds. That was the whole trick, more or less. The time a Hellcat needed to fire, drop into reverse, and be gone off its firing point before a German gunner could range the smoke. There was no ghost in it. There was a 50-mile-an-hour road speed, the fastest tracked vehicle on either side of the line, married to a gun that could be laid and fired in the time it takes to read this sentence. The Germans had met fast tanks and they had met hidden guns, but they had not met both welded into one machine, crewed by men who treated retreat as the second half of every shot. What felt like the supernatural was arithmetic. A gun that kills at 300 yards and a hull that clears the position before the answer comes back cannot be caught, because by the time you know where it was, it is somewhere it wasn't. Break the vanishing down, and it stops being magic and becomes a checklist. Scout the ground the day before. Range the reference points so no gunner has to guess. Pick the primary position, then the alternate, then the route between them, and drive the route until the driver could run it blind in fog. Fire from the flank, never the front. Displace after 1 or 2 shots, always, even when the shooting is good, especially when the shooting is good. None of that is written in the language of ghosts. It is written in the language of a battalion that came out of Tunisia, having learned the hard way that a tank destroyer which stays put is a tank destroyer that burns. And here is the part the folklore buried. The men who did this were not exceptional soldiers pulled from some elite pool. They were the ordinary product of an American training system that turned civilians into gun crews on an assembly line, and then let the survivors of North Africa teach the rest what the manuals left out. The doctrine McNair wrote was half wrong. The towed guns proved that in the Ardennes, dying where they stood because they could not run. But the half that was right, the fast self-propelled gun handled by crews who had permission to fight the ground instead of the enemy's strengths, was right in a way that broke 2 Panzer brigades in 3 days. The ghosts were the correction to McNair's own mistake, applied by sergeants and lieutenants who never got to argue doctrine in a Washington office. They just drove the routes they had scouted and waited for the flank. There is a detail here I keep turning over, and it goes nowhere, so I will just say it. The 704th's Hellcats had an open-top turret, no roof at all, and in the Lorraine rain the crews rigged tarps and baled water and cursed the men who designed it. That vulnerability, the thing that got Hellcat crews killed by airbursts and grenades in the towns, was also what let them hear a Panther's engine through the fog before they could see it. It cut both ways, and neither way was intended. The open top was a manufacturing compromise, not a tactic. 20 years on, the tank destroyer branch that fought at Arracourt no longer existed. The Army disbanded it after the war, folded the mission back into the tanks themselves, and decided the whole idea of a separate anti-armor arm had been a wartime detour. The Hellcat was sold off, scrapped, handed to a few foreign armies who ran them into the 1960s. The men who crewed them went home, took the jobs and the mortgages, and mostly did not tell the ghost story, because from the American side, it had never been a ghost story. It had been a good 3 days at work in bad weather. The German phrase, if it was ever really spoken as often as the histories claim, stayed a German phrase. The men it described would not have recognized themselves in it. What survives cleanest is the ledger. 2 Panzer brigades committed to break the American flank at Nancy. 2 Panzer brigades destroyed, their armor scattered burning across the beat fields, their crews counted into the prisoner cages, describing an enemy they could not find. A handful of American guns, and the men who ran them, doing the unglamorous thing correctly, over and over, until the other side ran out of tanks. Patton's Third Army did not stop to admire it. The order that came down was to keep moving east toward the Saar and the German border, and the 4th Armored's tank destroyers refueled, rearmed, and rolled out to scout the next set of positions. There was more ground ahead to walk before the next fog. The crews ate what they could out of cans on the move and went looking for the next flank.